Unless it gets delayed, Christopher Nolan's next film, Tenet, is supposed to come out in about 6 weeks. Leading up to it, I'm going to review all of Christopher Nolan's films. I've actually only reviewed one of his films on my channel, Dunkirk, and I plan to re-review it as it was an early review on my channel. But kicking off this series, we're going to start things off with his original film, the no-budget film Following. So let's talk about it. Following tells the story of a young writer that likes to follow people around just to watch them. But when someone spots him doing this, the person decides to escalate things with him and invites him to start breaking into people's houses to start experiencing their day-to-day life. So this is Christopher Nolan's very first film that he self-financed, and he essentially shot it with his friends with a budget of just $6,000.
I think what Following represents is kind of the peak of what I was able to do on my own or just with friends, just using our own resources and borrowing equipment and sort of using the things around us to make a film.
And that actually makes this kind of a difficult film to review because on the one hand, it has that Christopher Nolan voice to it. It has his abilities and everything. But at the same time, it's a film that's barely over an hour long. It's shot in black and white, and it's in kind of a square aspect ratio. And you can tell the limitations in certain sequences as you go through it. And normally I don't review films like this. Sometimes I don't even include them in my rankings for directors when they do films like this. But Christopher Nolan was a good enough director that even with no money, he was able to make a story that you got involved with the characters, watched it, could embrace it. So with that in mind, be sure to tell me your thoughts on it down below in the comment section. As I go into it, I'm not going to include spoilers on most of the rest of this series. I probably will. Since this is a smaller film that many of you probably haven't seen yet, I don't want to spoil any of the twists and turns that happen in the third act of the film. But if you've seen it, go ahead and tell me what you thought about it down below in the comment section. And keep in mind, it is a $6,000 film, so there are some limitations that go with that. With that said, let's get started talking about the good. Probably the best thing that this movie does is it finds a way to keep the narrative engaging by a series of reveals. They knew they didn't have the budget to have a bunch of action and spectacle to keep the audience engaged, so instead they keep reframing the story so that you reinterpret everything that you've already seen. You're introduced to characters and you meet them, and when you first see it, you interpret it one way, you understand their relationship in one way, and later on it reveals new information that makes you reinterpret what happened, and you get to the third act and it reveals even more information that makes you rethink everything that you've seen in the entire film. The whole movie is non-linear, so it keeps teasing what's coming, so you know something's going to go off, something's going to go wrong, but you don't know what it is or when it's going to happen. And so some of the images are just kind of bizarre. They're unusual. Like, why is this person acting in this manner? And then you learn later on why that happened. And then you kind of get the final information that ties it all together. And so instead of trying to keep audiences engaged through having big fight sequences, chases, he couldn't do that. And so he wrote a script that makes you go, oh, that's interesting. And you keep rethinking it, and you want to see more to figure out how it all ties together. And likewise, he wrote a script that's not too long. The movie is like 70 minutes long. It's barely over an hour, so it doesn't overstay its welcome for the series of twists and turns and reveals that it has. This is actually the technique that a lot of these binge documentaries that are on Netflix use. They have a whole bunch of different pieces of information about whatever they're documenting, and they frame the episodes in a way that you kind of connect with the narrative as it's presented. And then at the end of the episode, they have this new reveal that makes you go, oh, well, I look at everything you just told me very differently now. And it makes you go, I want to see what's coming next. They have all the information, they tell it out of order so that it keeps you engaged and keeps you wanting to keep watching. Those are the techniques that Nolan used in a bunch of his early films, Memento doing it once again. And it's a really clever way to tell stories. He just had a knack from the very beginning of understanding what keeps people engaged and interested in characters and stories, and how you can use when you reveal information as a technique to make a story more interesting to people. And that's really the glue that holds this one together, is that cleverness with the storytelling. In prepping this review, I actually watched an interview that Vice did with Christopher Nolan, where basically he talked about the making of this movie for about 25 minutes long. And I highly encourage you to check it out if you're a Nolan fan, because it really informs you of just how much his indie background influenced everything that he did afterwards, and how stuff that he learned to do with this film that he had to do just became part of how he made films, even when he was working on the biggest budget films of certain years.
A few cheap tricks that I've used ever since, like doing dry takes. I mean, interestingly for me, on The Dark Knight, when we were shooting with IMAX cameras where you couldn't get any usable sound, we did exactly that. We did that with Christian Bale and Heath Ledger. We got the sound for all of their scenes by doing that exactly the same technique. And to me, it was interesting that something you learned, on a tiny film was absolutely essential to this enormous film that we then did.
But he talked a lot in that interview about how much he tried to make wise choices because it was a no-budget film, and he didn't want to include anything that pulled you out of the movie. And so from the construction of the story to the idea to even make it this noir film so it fits the black and white, all of it was designed to be like this. And so it's able to cover up a lot of the low budget aspect, not all of them. There's some low budget stuff that you certainly feel and notice, but it hides a lot of that by feeling like a movie from the 40s or 50s because of the black and white and being that kind of story, while still having Nolan's voice in the way it's all told and designed. And with the black and white, it has a distinct look to it that I don't know that the movie would have worked if it was a lot longer, but it was just this nice little narrative with a clever idea to it. But from there, we got to move on to the bad. The thing that stands out the most about the low budget here is the audio.
One of the things I figured out is if we start the film in voiceover, and if we started with the first scene in a very controlled environment with two people just talking where we knew we could get good sound, and it actually worked pretty well. You would go to festivals with the film, and the film would start, and it would sound pretty good for the first couple of minutes. And then by the time people realize, just how cheap this film is and how bad it sounds, they're already into the story.
When it comes to being shot in black and white, that almost aids the film because it does make the film feel like it's from the 40s or 50s, except it happens to take place in the 90s. But when it comes to the audio, there's parts where it's difficult to understand what they're saying. There's noise in the background. It's unclear. And that's where you can just feel like they didn't have the time, the equipment to capture proper audio or the best audio. And so you notice how bad it is at certain points in time. Likewise, the non-linear aspects are intended to be a little bit disorienting. They're supposed to introduce you to things that make you go, oh, I wonder what that is. But it can actually be pretty confusing because it's shot in black and white and it's shown at different points in time. People get haircuts, they get injured. Even though there's only like 4 or 5 people in the whole movie, at times I was unclear of like, who am I seeing? What am I seeing? I know I'm not supposed to know what this means, but I really don't know what I'm looking at right now because of the lighting, because of the black and white. And some of that I think needed to be a little bit more clear because at a certain point in time, confusing, disorienting is just off-putting. And this one dabbled into the off-putting just a little bit with some of it. And as you move into the third act, and it kind of gives you the final reveals that tie it all together, you go, that was clever, that works. It's also not like this awesome twist at the end that's super memorable. When it comes to the movie Memento, you watch it one time and you'll always remember the storytelling technique that was used and the twist at the end and what it means in regards to the whole film, because it's just very memorable. The whole thing is very well thought out. This one, it's a little bit more of like, oh, okay, gotcha. I see what you were doing there, how that worked. That was pretty clever. But it's also very familiar to those types of movies from the 90s. There were a lot of these kind of crime films that were indie, low budget, that have this twist ending to them. And this just kind of feels like another one of those. It's not particularly memorable, while given the restrictions they had, given the budget they had, very impressive nonetheless. Real quick before I give you my final score and take on this one, be sure to tell me what you thought down below in the comments section. If you haven't seen it, I really do think you should check this one out if you're a cinephile, if you're a Christopher Nolan fan. I know it is low budget, but it is definitely worth checking out. Also remember, I will be reviewing all of Christopher Nolan's films. At the time I'm releasing this, there's only one video in this playlist right up here, but I'm gonna have a playlist right up there with all of the Christopher Nolan movie reviews that I'm doing, which will be all of his films. So if you're watching in the future, there'll be more of them right up there. When it comes to this film, like I mentioned at the beginning, it's a little bit difficult to score and review because you are watching a movie that was made for almost no budget, where he borrowed equipment and he just got his friends to help him make a movie. And so when you think about it in terms of all the restrictions that he had, it is an incredible accomplishment. But when it comes to Nolan films, is it one that I'm likely to rewatch a lot in and of itself, other than for the purpose of discussing it? Probably not. It's a neat movie to watch once to see just how good Nolan was from the very beginning and watch kind of his movie-making origin story. It's very cool in that regard and well made in that sense. It's incredible, actually, what he was able to do with this budget. But if you're comparing it to everything else that he did, you're also seeing a very quaint, small film that its budget very much hampers certain aspects of the film. But if you're a fan of cinema, if you're a fan of Christopher Nolan, if you're someone looking to make films yourself, this is a must watch to see what he was able to do and see all of kind of his skills coming into play that he would perfect in later films when he had a bigger budget and more time. But here, you're seeing the origins of one of today's greatest filmmakers. Overall, I think I'd give this movie a B. On the entertainment scale, it's a 7 out of 10. And this is a must watch for any cinephiles or Christopher Nolan fans. If you're watching this video when I first debuted it, there's a playlist right over there that only has this video. But if you're watching in the future, all of my other Christopher Nolan reviews will appear in that one. Come back next Sunday, I'll have Memento over there in that playlist. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.